Okay, we on? Just waiting for the last stragglers to come in here, then we'll get started. A couple of secs. So we'll just give it 30 seconds and we'll get started. Actually, I'm just making an excuse for waiting for central admin to load up, really. Yeah, we're forever waiting, aren't we? Tried and tested patience methodology. We ought to write a white paper on that. The methodology behind how we actually get past how many coffees we can drink whilst we wait for a page to load in SharePoint Central Admin. If only we could have had the RTM bits, right? What a shame. You never know. We never know. They might be on MSDN sooner than we realise, and who knows what you might get to see Wednesday. Oh, be optimistic, come on. Okay, let's get ourselves started here. How are you doing, everybody? Good morning. My name's Steve Smith from Combined Knowledge, and this is IT 102 for service, the architecture model and services model with SharePoint 2010. We are kind of trying to follow a bit of a pattern with the sessions, despite all the problems that we've had with speakers' moves and changes in sessions and everything. One of the things that we really wanted to keep in the IT Pro track was that fluidity between what you're going to learn steps at a time so that you can build a big picture by the end of the third day. And so we're going to try and take you on that journey throughout the 3 days experience. In Spence's session, and Neil's, they gave you a bit of an intro into some of the stuff you're going to see. This is going to be the first of those kind of drill downs into that early architecture stuff. These are the things that you need to get right before you go live. This is key stuff that you need to take away to help you plan and build that model before you ever start creating the collaborative environment. So it's all pretty important in terms of that early planning cycle. Now, for those of you that weren't here earlier, this is the IT Pro room, so we are in here all 3 days, okay? So every session is going to be in here for the IT Pro, unless you're going to go to one of the deep dives, because, of course, some of our IT Pro sessions are deep dive as well. They're going to be upstairs on the next floor in the Westminster room. So what are we going to talk about in the next hour? Okay, we've got an hour. And obviously, did you all get the Twitter things? You've all got those Twitter IDs if you want to text questions at some point during the conference. Then when we get to the Ask the Experts on Wednesday, we can deal with some of that stuff. I'm not sure how much time I'll have for Q&A in this session, but I'll be floating around as well outside. So we're going to, first thing we're going to talk about is it's not just about SharePoint's architecture. One of the most important aspects for any IT pro that's going to be working with SharePoint is there's a whole infrastructure model that it relies upon. And if we don't get the understanding of how that's all talking with each other, how are we ever going to expect to troubleshoot it or talk with the right people in order to solve those problems or get the things implemented right in the first place? Then we're going to move on to the services architecture specifically. And the reason we're going to move on to that is because obviously there's an awful lot of sessions for the rest of the next 3 days that are going to home in specifically at each of those services and how we build them and scale them out and capacity plan them, etc. So we need to make sure we understand how the services model has changed and what's new in 2010. 2010, now there's an interesting concept, right? 2010, 2010, you know, which way do we go? How many in the audience has been saying 2010? How many of you out there have been saying that? Nobody, so you've all been saying 2010, yeah? All right, so that's, according to the psychologists of the world, nothing to do with SharePoint, but if you say 2010, you're pretty young. It's a youthful thing. It's a good thing. So yeah, we're going to go down 2010, right? We're going to stick with that. And finally, we're going to bring it all together, and I'm going to go into Central Admin and show you where we're going to do some of this stuff and where it's all configured. So obviously, we need to talk about getting the architecture right. It's very important that we plan it and get it structured so it all works out as we wanted. Alternatively, we could end up with that. We knew what we wanted. It looked like this fantastic 4-bedroom detached house in the country. Fantastic. Next thing we know, we're living in a caravan park in a nice little bucket shed. Is it going to be the same experience for the person living in it? Not at all. Although you could try and sell it, as some people try to do, right? Of course, if you're going to do that one, don't call it SharePoint, right? Because in 6 months' time, when you have to rename it, you don't want to call it SharePoint again because the users just won't go back there, okay? But we need to be wary of that. The architecture is critical. So some key architectural components that we need to consider as part of our planning and design strategy. The actual design architecture is very important. And we're not just talking about designing it as an IT pro. We're talking about designing it in line with the development cycle. We're talking about aligning it with our business processes. We're talking about aligning it with project managers and the whole piece that's coming together of where we as a business want to actually get this product. And again, another problem that companies make is that they try and think of this as a 1-year plan or a 6-month plan instead of a 5 to 10 year real approach to how we are going to use SharePoint to change the way we do business. And I'm actually doing a session after this one on user adoption and how we can actually take that, and I've actually got some slides that kind of help you put this into perspective and how you can take it away and actually work with those different teams within the business unit to make it all come together, and also some realistic timeframes as well. So if we don't get the planning and design architecture right in terms of the business logic, the vision to implementation, it's going to be virtually impossible to actually make it work. Unless, of course, it works according to IT pro land, which, of course, doesn't really help us, is it, in the reality of SharePoint? Because we need to be building the infrastructure based on what we want to achieve as a business unit. I'm going to look at the platform architecture as well, so we're going to move on to that in a minute. Of course, things have fundamentally changed in the prerequisites and the requirements of 2010 in terms of hardware and the pieces that we need to build upon before we've actually got SharePoint up and running, be it SharePoint Server or SharePoint Foundation. So we're going to have a quick look at the underlying components that we as IT pros need to understand. We're going to look at the physical architecture. And again, we've got another session tomorrow that I'm doing on capacity planning, scaling out, all that kind of stuff, you know, which the architecture of the physical boxes and our topology is going to be affected by. But again, we have to take this into real consideration with the shift into 64-bit, right? So there's a lot of things to consider, especially those of you that are on 2007. How many of those are in this room on 2007? Right. How many of you are planning to migrate to 2010? Gosh, you guys, you've got to go to the upgrade sessions, right? So we started off doing the upgrade sessions. We started off with one session. We realised we had just too much stuff to try and fit into one session, that for you guys who are going to think about how are we going to do it, you've just got too many options to think about. So we've broken it into 2 sessions. One is very much around things to think about, what you need to consider as part of that migration, and the other one is very much heavy demo where you're actually going to see some content databases doing their wonderful thing in the migration process. It's one of those that always works first time, you know that type of thing. We're then going to look at the SharePoint logical architecture. So the SharePoint logical architecture is, of course, the bit where we start planning. Now that we know how we want to structure our collaborative and our services architecture, how does that all piece together? You know, how does it go top down from the farm, working with your web applications? How are they all aligning to actually providing those web applications with the services that we want to give them? So the logical architecture all the way down to the site collection and site model is very important as that kind of final piece to that planning and design architecture that you've been busy at. This is where it all comes together. And then we'll also have a quick look at the administrative model. Something that a lot of people kind of shied away from in 7 was the ability to delegate rights and access to a lot of the site levels, even within a farm, to power users or site collection admins. And so we had a situation where it was very much controlled at the very top and core layers by IT, and only at very low levels did we actually pass that over to the site owners or site collection admins. And trying to get that administrative architecture in 2010 is critical, because there's been a lot of work done in allowing you to give people more access to certain key things that they might need to do to save the IT pros having to do it. Because you all enjoyed updating keywords, right? I mean, you loved it. It was the second best thing on your day. So we want other people to be doing this stuff, not us. And we need to know where we can delegate that right. So this is a slide that we've been using for a while now, and we've been trying to put this together, not from one particular source, but we've tried to combine many facets of the approach and the business logic and aligning it to a strategy and the different parts within the business units that are going to be involved in building that SharePoint design. And so what we've tried to do is break it down into some key components. On the left-hand side and the top are obviously key to the whole thing. So the top one you have to have before you start, which is the vision and the strategy. Now, if there's no vision of where you're going to go and how long you want to take to get there, it's not going to work, right? So as part of the architecture, you have to think about your design architecture from this type of approach. On the left-hand side, we've got governance, information assurance. IT pros aren't going to be involved in the governance planning. These are going to be specialists who understand governance and business. So whether you have those skills in-house or whether somebody comes in and helps you, it's still going to be important. Findability across the board. You know, the garbage in, garbage out theory. Findability is critical, especially in 2010, where we've suddenly got these plethora of new mechanisms of surfacing up data and ways to put stuff in. And if we put it all in a really bad way and tag it wrongly or don't get our content types right or our metadata or all the rest of this stuff, then the findability just does not work. So there's many different ways that we can approach findability in the product. And there's lots of sessions both in the power user track and in the IT pro tracks like the search and manage metadata and content types in the power user. You know, there's lots of sessions that can help you understand this model. And that's important though, isn't it? Because if you think about it, a lot of this stuff, enterprise content management, findability, it involves you guys because you've got to build and configure and define those services that are going to be used to deploy those feature sets. But it's the business and the users that are actually going to help you define what needs to be in that and how many of them you might need, whether you need, you know, different search configurations for different groups of people. So all these things are going to be affected by it. So we've got very common streams here, ECM, findability and governance, that will span your design architecture. We've also got things like taxonomy and folksonomy, which is that whole social networking piece and, you know, the my sites, how do we work as an individual and network with other people, and then how do we have a structured top-down effect where we've got our taxonomy based on, say, site structures, site directory structures, query-based navigation at the top, so it's surfacing up an aggregation of content. I mean, who defines that stuff? And it's impossible for IT pros to take all this on board. You just cannot build this thing. It's impossible. You can't do it. It has to be built with people that are in that space doing that and understanding, aligning business needs and business logic. The information architecture is a huge piece on its own. Finding out what type of document management features you're going to implement and where and who's going to get what and when does in-place records take place and when does it become an official compliance item and how is that managed? How does that align to a workflow? How does that then go into web content management if we've got an internet-facing site? And then finally, the content itself. You know, how are we structuring the content? Is it based on team-based collaboration? Is it based on surfacing content aggregation and then having people access the deep down levels from there? If we do not get this architecture piece right, we are already in trouble, right? Before we even get to building our services architecture, which we're going to look at in a minute. How many people in this room, and don't be afraid to put your hand up, would say that they successfully followed this model for 2007? Fantastic. One person. How many people wished they'd followed this type of model with 2007? Right. Kind of says a lot, doesn't it? So obviously this slide's going to be on your DVD. Take it to the people that need it. Platform architecture. Okay, so SharePoint's all very well and good, but without some key components underneath it, it doesn't really work. And the biggest mistake we make as IT pros is always thinking that the problem we have when SharePoint starts to hiccup is that it's a SharePoint problem. But we've got all these other things that take place before it. The Windows Server operating system, 2008, 64-bit. R2, preferably. R2 has many advancements over the R1, PowerShell enhancements, new commandlets that can help. One of the things I'll talk about tomorrow in capacity planning is some of the new network load balancing capabilities, where we can actually have PowerShell automatically bang a network load balance host into the cluster if one should fail. So you've got that auto failover, bringing a server in, bringing it into the load balance server. R2 has some really great PowerShell commandlets that automatically make that happen. The other thing about 64-bit server is that obviously performance. We're going to get huge performance increases. So again, we'll be talking about that tomorrow. How many of you in this room have got 64-bit 2007? Fantastic. How many of you have got 64-bit across the board, SQL, SharePoint, everything ready? Okay, a bit less. How many of you got to go from 64-bit to get to 64-bit SQL? How many of you have to do that at some point in the next near future? Right, so that's a separate migration project, right? But nonetheless, you still have to get there before we can go to 2010. Notice that the SQL database element is 64-bit. This was a decision made in the planning side of the 2010 bits development when they made the decision that they were going to go 64-bit SQL as well as a prereq. This is a big decision, right, to make that prereq, because this alone can delay the actual deployment of SharePoint 2010, because people have to deal with that before they deal with SharePoint. But it's an important factor. Obviously, 2005 with the right service packs and 2008 with the right service packs and cumulative updates is supported. We've also got, obviously, SQL R2, 2008 R2 on the horizon. Now, obviously, from a performance perspective, when we talk tomorrow, we're going to be discussing a lot about how we get impact on performance of those different variants. Now, you may hear on various blogs and public notice out there that, it supports 32-bit SQL. It will run, but it's not supported at all. So I don't ever recommend that you try and do that in any form of production or anything. Now, obviously, SharePoint is, in essence, an enhanced website. You know, for those of us that have been in IIS for many years, it's really just a website that's got a bunch of code lobbed on top of it. And we still have our users go to the home page. We control security. We control performance to that website through IIS. So IIS 7... How many of you recently looked at IIS 7 for the first time, say in the last 6 months? Yeah, and out of those people, how many went, oh my God, what is this? Yeah, it's just like, oh dear, everything's just moved and changed. It's a great, IIS 7 is fantastic, the way it's changed, the way the service accounts work with the websites, the way the permissions have been structured down, the way that we can manage SSL certificates and all the rest of it. But underneath the core hub, it's still, for those of us who know IIS, we can find our way around and get things configured. But in terms of performance, scalability, it is just fantastic compared to IIS 6. So again, underneath the hood, we've got to have IIS 7. R2 of server gives us 7.5. It's just basically an enhanced set again on R2. So if you were going to be looking at server 2008, you really should be on R2. That's the one you should be aiming for. .NET Framework. So, of course, the .NET Framework, if you've got R2, has got the correct version of .NET Framework on for installing SharePoint 2010. If you've got R1, you need to download the correct .NET Framework 3.5 SP1 minimum. And we have, of course, got 4 on the horizon, or was it out last week? No. It was last week, wasn't it? They announced it at Tech Days, or whatever it's called. Tech thing, last week. So, yeah, so we've got the latest version coming out then. Now, of course, the .NET Framework handles many different areas of the SharePoint space, things like ASP.NET. So, as an IT pro, I always used to see ASP.NET on 32-bit when we used to have the queues growing, when our front-end servers couldn't handle all the user requests, and ASP.NET queues went, oh my gosh, what do we do? Because they couldn't send them through to SQL fast enough. We've got some new components in the .NET Framework that SharePoint is heavily leveraging in 2010, such as WCF, the Communications Foundation, which when I show you a slide later on about the service application architecture, you'll see the WCF piece is very important now in the way that our back-end architecture is going to talk to our front-end architecture. And from a developer's perspective, they're going to be heavily using WCF now as part of their service application creation development that Mr. Woodward is going to show you today, I believe, later today, and in the dev track. We've got the WPF, the Presentation Foundation, so all that goodness that you can take with Silverlight and all these other, your master page, all these other good stuff that you can, render a page and make it look completely non-like SharePoint. It just looks really good for the people that are looking at it. That's your Presentation Foundation that's going to be working on that. We've also got the Workflow Foundation, which is obviously the core of our developers to create workflows, SharePoint Designer, or the third-party companies. and the forms as well rendering. So the .NET framework is a busy boy. He plays a key part in a lot of that communication and presentation and the way in which the pages are being rendered to the user through IIS, through server. So this is not always a SharePoint problem if a page is not rendering correctly, or a security pop-up's coming up for the 8th time for a user who's just hopped across a web application. It's just IIS saying there's something else that's amiss here with the configuration somewhere. It's not necessarily SharePoint. We've also got the Geneva framework, which it used to be known as, which is now the Identity Foundation. And this, of course, is one of the critical components in one of the new 2010 feature sets called claims-based authentication. The ability for us to have users connect to our web application environment for many different facets, such as forms-based auth or Windows auth or a basic auth or whatever form of authentication you want to invoke, but have it all be sent to SharePoint as a single point of reference for authentication. So for those people that have any form of external connection into SharePoint, they've got different types of users trying to connect using different types of mechanisms, this is what the developers are going to create some great front-end logon methodologies using this feature set. So I believe we have a claims, Spence is doing claims tomorrow, I believe, from the dev side, about taking you through how that is all structured and how you build it. So that's an important piece. Of course, the Geneva package has got more than that. Basically, the Geneva framework, as it was then, is just a bunch of building blocks. There's a whole bunch of building blocks that allows developers to build solutions on top of all those building blocks that SharePoint will utilize. The SharePoint Foundation, obviously, this is our freebie 2010 Foundation server. We're going to decide acronyms, right? SPF 2010. My kind of wife had a thing about sun cream and that nonsense when I mentioned this. I went, I don't know, that's what I'm going to call it, though. We can banter about acronyms, right? Obviously, it's the free version. You do have some functionality, certainly collaboration, very departmental, although having said that, with Search Express add-ons and the ability to have BCS under the hood. You know, there's quite a lot of feature sets in Foundation now. I'm not exactly still convinced that it would ever be any good scalable enterprise-wise, but it would certainly be a very powerful small to medium, I'll say small business use and departmental use. And obviously scalable for migration to server. And of course, Server 2010 bolting in the final element of all this, which is all our cool extended feature sets, all the enterprise level stuff that we've all come to really love and make the most of in terms of all your Excel services, your info path services, and all the add-ons like Fast for SharePoint and all those other really core enterprise feature sets that we've now got. Obviously, a lot of what we're talking about in the next 3 days from the IT pros heavily affects server, but there is a lot of what we talk about that still would affect a Foundation deployment. But the key to this is just so we can see, we don't just rely on SharePoint. As a platform, it relies on a lot of other things. And we obviously have things like physical architecture, which heavily affect it as well, right? And not just the physical architecture as in the servers themselves, but what about the underlying physical network? I mean, SharePoint and its connecting servers to SQL should have a minimum gigabit LAN connecting those boxes. Minimum. Depends on which traffic's obviously flying through it. But if you've got other server traffic going in between your servers communicating for SharePoint with all its indexing and data retrieval and going to the SQL to the web front ends, there's a lot of stuff going on. So if your bandwidth's limited, SharePoint's just going to suffer. So your clients will be experiencing slow rendering and all the rest of it. But it might not be anything to do with your front end to the client. It might be the server's architecture actually not talking well. Of course, we have 3 possible tiers in SharePoint 2010. And I suppose we've always had the application front-end tier model that we had with 2007. I do think 2010, though, is probably the first time we've actually had SharePoint as a truly scalable and isolated model. In other words, true 3-tier, where we actually have the application tier, which could have a service such as the Web Analytics service, and I've got an example of this later, where that's doing a bunch of gathering and resource grabbing of logs and all the health files and event logs and all the rest of it, working at the application layer with the database layer, getting all that information grabbed together, bundled together into some great other presentation and reporting databases, and then surfacing it up to the web front ends so that you or a user can go and actually get that data and do something with it and read it and all the rest of it. So we do have true three-tier models where we can literally span our services and add our servers. Of course, one of the great things with the physical architecture in 2010 is we no longer rely so much on web front-end servers from the 32-bit age, where the only option we had on 32-bit front ends, if we needed more oomph for concurrent users, was to add another web front end, because we were limited on the amount of memory that a 32-bit could actually get. Now with 64-bit, of course, from a capacity planning and scalability, we really have the sudden question of, could one server actually cut it if we gave it enough memory and enough resources, or do we still have two web front-end servers, not for capacity, but for resilience? And we'll discuss more about that tomorrow's session. The application tier is obviously the ability for us to farm out our service applications such as indexing or Excel or search or query servers, and box them out onto separate boxes for performance and scalability in that realm as well. And as you can see in a minute, we've got fantastic options for this now above 2007. Neil Hodgkinson is doing a session on things like search, for example, and Neil's going to talk about that scalability of the search area. So each application has its own specific area that you can actually configure and manage from this. So the admin model. We start at the farm. Obviously, farm administrators. We can obviously delegate people to be farm administrators. It's a select few people who can do this. But we can, of course, delegate the rights. And in SharePoint 2007, we obviously had the central admin, and then we obviously had the site collection managing the shared service provider, right? And we could delegate people access to the shared service provider. And one of the things that we have in 2010 that we're going to look at shortly is the application services model. And again, like the SSP, but a lot more granular, we can delegate admin permissions at the application services layer as well as the farm layer. So it's a bit like Active Directory. You know, you don't make everybody a domain admin. Same way we don't make everybody a farm admin. We give people rights at the necessary place where they need to do that job. The web application is still a core admin part of the isolated model. So there's still a lot we can configure at the web app layer where we define the permissions that are then available below it. You know, things like the actual permissions of the web app itself. I don't know how many people have actually used this, but it's been around for many years with SharePoint, since 3. And it was a great feature that if you ever go to the web application, you'll notice you can turn on and off the security elements that become available to the groups in the collaborative space from the site collection down. So, for example, you could turn off the setting that said allow people to change themes, which was obviously a key one, because if you've just gone and spent 6 months developing and branding site templates, and then a site collection admin just goes on and says, oh, actually, I like the green theme, I think I'm going to go for that now. You know, it became a big problem. And so if we turned it off at the web app, even if you were a site collection admin, IIS, we've just bypassed the whole SharePoint model. We've just ripped that permission out of IIS. And it is no longer available to any site collection in that web app. So the web app is still very much an isolation of the management piece, and it affects a lot of things below it. We have a lot of configuration things that we can do there. Web applications, site collections below that. Obviously, site collections are huge. So much stuff has been moved into the site collection in 2010, where we as administrators might configure it in the services model, but the actual configuration and day-to-day updates of a lot of the content would be managed by users. And a good example of that would be the managed metadata service, or the publishing of content types from the enterprise, where we can, as a site collection admin, go into our site collection and choose what of that enterprise level stuff we want to pull down. And if I've got the rights to, I can actually go back up to the term set in the MMS and add my own terms, because I'm an expert in my area. So they become very important people, site collection admins. How many of you IT pros in the audience now have very much controlled site collections in the past from your space? How many of you have had to sort of be in charge of site collections? Okay, and it is a problem. You know, we've got to, it's that again, it's that design process where you've got to look into how you will delegate off to those people who have got the ability to manage them. I guess that's another problem, isn't it? Training those site collection people to do it right. It's getting that investment time in that as well. Obviously, the site level is still an administrative piece. You know, just because we have a site collection called operations, we could have second-tier sites that saw different types of operations with completely different groups of people managing it. So, again, we still have an administrative model there. I don't count lists and libraries as an administrative model, because if you start delegating all of those to different groups of people, it kind of switches to a nightmare administrative model rather than a good administrative model. All right, so the logical architecture. We've slightly changed this, haven't we, from 2007? This is kind of what it looks like when we build it. But one thing you'll notice in this slide straight away is instead of me having a shared service provider, which has gone, I have individual application services, each of them doing a specific job. So in SharePoint 2007, we had things like Excel services, we had search, we had my site management profiles, all in the SSP, right? In SharePoint 2010, they have all been given their own space. And not only have they all been given their own space, we can create as many of them as we like. Ooh. Once we've created our application services, in terms of the logical topology, we will then still associate those services with a web application. So in 2007, we used to associate a web application with a shared service provider. In 2010, we associate a web application with a specific service. And we can cherry pick which services are going to go to which web application. Everything we asked for in 7, that we all grumbled, hated and moaned about, has been given to us on a plate with silver cutlery. It's very nice. We like it. This is great. This is fun. This is where we want to be. And when we talk about scalability, it adds a whole new element of the ability to scale services in a large farm topology. So the web applications are still associated, but they're associated with services rather than a bigger component. Site collections still live under the web applications. But of course, because some of these application services are now enterprise aware, such as content types, it obviously adds our ability now to have that central core store of content types, publish them, and subscribe to them in whichever site collections we choose. So we now have this. So SharePoint 2007 on the left, 2010 on the right. You'll notice the profile service on this example is being associated with 2 different web applications. Ooh, we could not do this before, right? We created a shared service provider. It was one web app to the SSP. I can now create a service, application service, and I can say, I am going to consume it from the partner's web app, and in the corporate web app, yeah, I think I'll consume that as well, because that's a standard approach we want to use. So think about it from the sense that as a design model, all of those design restrictions that you had in 2007 around creating one SSP, and then just because you had a group of site collections for, say, a partner, extranet or whatever, you actually had to go and create another shared service provider because you wanted to try and isolate the services that they were being given, and you didn't want them consuming the corporate search. And it became a nightmare, so it was easier just to create another SSP and give it to those people. Now we don't have to worry about it. Now we can create lots of web applications, create lots of services, and then just decide who gets what. And we can just turn them on and off. It's literally just a tick box, as I'll show you in a minute. So I've just, this is by no means the full extent. I've got another slide in a minute. But what I wanted to show you here about these application services is we still have a lot of the functionality that we wanted in 7. So things like the ability to provision a service so that it could be consumed by other web applications in other farms. Remember we could do that in 7, where we could actually take an SSP and we could say, I want this SSP to be a parent and I want any other shared service provider, even in other farms, to consume from it. And it basically just created a child object which wasn't really existing in the child farm. All it really did was when you connected to it, it went to the parent farm and started grabbing the required data. The problem with that was WAN links, right? Because we were consuming an SSP. So we can do that again. Now, in order to be able to do that publishing to other farms, obviously we need to make sure that the services themselves have got their own little space and their provisioning, and so that it's a bit faster, but also that they perform better over a WAN link for certain key services. Think of a corporate managed metadata service with a corporate term set, and then sharing that term store across 6 different farms around Europe. And then having individual term stores of metadata specific for the UK and France and Germany and Spain. We can do that now. You'll also notice on some of these services that I've listed here that I've also listed, apart from the fact that they can be published to other farms, also the fact that they have a database. So not all services have a specific SQL database, but many do. And so remember the shared service provider scenario in 7 where we would have a shared services database. Okay, we had a search database as well, but that was it. So all your profiles and all your other settings in the SSP went into one database. And if that database got corrupt or you migrated it or moved to another server, it created secondary problems. So what's happened now is because all the applications, all those services that we had in 7, plus some of the new services that require a database have their own specific content database. So we have that scalability, performance and management now on an individual service layer. Things like search, people, managed metadata, web analytics, oh my word. How many people here have tried playing with the beta of 2010 so far? How many people have been having a mess around? Cool. How many of you were messing around on servers with more than 8 gig of RAM? Okay, very few of you. How many of you turned web analytics on? How many of you quickly turned it off? Because this thing just sucked the life because it was doing so much. You had all these databases. It was grabbing all your logs and all your job definitions. All those things were going on. It was going, give me more, give me more. It was, as a service, it was so hungry. But the stuff it brought out was fantastic. So this is another thing we're going to have to consider. When we look at the service scalability and capacity planning, we've got to think about not all services now are the same. Some require more TLC configuration and performance looking after than others. And the web analytics is certainly one of them. We've got some other application services, and there will be more. I mean, this is not by any means the extent of the list, because obviously as SharePoint, as a product, as a platform, is obviously, I mean, dare we say it, SharePoint, everything leads to SharePoint. It's the way it's going, right? As people add other productivity and other elements into their products, they're going to be integrated with SharePoint, so we'll see more application services. What about things like CRM? All those future products that are going to start melding into SharePoint. And we've got things like, in 2010, Access services, Excel services, Visio, the word conversion stuff, data collection services that we will utilize in our site collections. Performance Point. Performance Point, what was a huge product before, is now part of a service itself within SharePoint. So we can see how big SharePoint is getting, right? Each of these individual components that we're looking at is a huge understanding and project in its own right. So if we think we're going to light up all of these services and give it to our users in a 3-month life cycle and bang, you've got it, there you go, it's not going to happen. In fact, go one step further. If you try to light up all of these things and say to your users, there you go, their heads are just going to go, boom, and it will be very messy. So we're going to have to take a lot of planning and understanding how all these services actually work and who's going to manage them and how we're going to configure them before we light a lot of them up. From an IT pros perspective, we've also got to consider how we're going to scale them, which servers are going to run them, and how many users are going to do that particular action so that we can capacity plan for it. Did anybody in this room actually try and publish an SSP to another farm? Did anyone actually do it? Do a parent-child relationship? Right? I mean, of course, we could have done it in 2003, right? One of the problems we had with doing that was we had to delegate service accounts with the right to access the shared service provider. One of the nice things we've now got with the 2010 architecture is the ability to actually create a trust between farms using certificate authentication between the farms. So we can basically say, because we've got a trusted link between the two farms and we've got the PKI trust there, all you need to know, if I've published a service, I'll send you this really short URL, and you're going to put that in your connect to another service, and because the trust between the farms is already there, as long as you know what service you're going to connect to at the other end, you've got it. And now you can start consuming those services without actually having to know what service account can I use to do so. Which was always a big problem between farms, right? So the publishing mechanism is a really nice feature, especially when I said earlier, if you're going to do something like manage metadata, like a corporate version of that, and then have it consumed not necessarily by web apps, but by other farms as well. So here's an example of the service application architecture, where we've obviously got our clients at the front connecting. So we've got browser clients, the browser-based, or a client application like Office or whatever. And we're connecting to SharePoint through web parts and web services, custom code, whatever. But then we have this thing called a proxy. And the proxy is basically there making sure that when we create a grouping of services, they are aligned to the correct web applications. So don't think of a proxy as a physical entity. Think of it as, I have one default group, proxy group, which obviously by default would probably have all your services encompassed into it. But what if I wanted to create several groupings of services for different sets of web applications? So the corporate intranet would have certain services. The partner's web application will have certain services, but they're not all the same. So what I might want to do is group those services together and proxy it through the web application. So think of the proxy as the middle tier that says, you're coming in using this service, therefore these are the web applications and services that are aligned to you. So if, for example, real-world example of that, Excel services. I've got Excel services across two boxes. So the proxy knows that those two services are all aligned. And obviously, from a user connection, they might use a configuration component for one Excel services data connection, and then they might use another one. As long as those are combined together, the proxy makes sure it all works. It's just a grouping. But in between that, we've got the WCF interface. So we've got the communication foundation layer here, which is working between that front-end layer from that actual connection that the user's making, and then talking to the application service logic itself that's running on the app server. Now, obviously, if this is one box, it's all running all on one box. But if it's two boxes, you've got a web front-end and an application box in the middle, then obviously the application itself, say Excel services or web analytics, as another example, the web analytics component is doing all the work. The WCF is making sure that the front end, where we look for our reports and trends and everything else, is communicating correctly with the application service running on the middle box. And it's the middle tier, that application service logic, that's talking to the various databases that it's working with. So does this create potential for, when you're troubleshooting connectivity to back-end components through, the client? Does it add another kind of layer of complexity of troubleshooting? Sure. So when the developers are busy doing WCF stuff and they get it wrong, they've got this communication taking place to the service application. But you're not going to get it wrong, because Andrew's going to teach you how to get it right from day one for the devs. So that's what we always like. So I just thought I'd give you a quick example before we go on to the central admin, just to quickly show you an example of one service architecture, how it's working. So again, not only have we got a common services architecture But we've also got specific architectures per service. And it depends what the service is that determines how complex it gets. This is a pretty good example of one that's doing a lot of work. We can see at the top that we've got this thing called a correlation ID. You'll probably hear this bandied around for the next 3 days. For those of you who have not heard about it, everything in 2010 is given a correlation ID, which means that we can correlate result sets as things go wrong and then find out what the whole traceability of when it started to when it finished. So we can align correlation IDs to troubleshooting the multi-steps that happened at the point when it failed. Nice. In the example of web analytics, on the left-hand side, we've got the sort of stuff that the service is grabbing. Trace logs, server counters, service apps, SQL counters, ULS logs, SharePoint logging. All that stuff's being brought together. It's being shoved through the web service into the database that you define in SQL. It then has analytical components in the application layer that's grabbing all that data, manipulating it around, turning it into usable data, shoving it into the reporting database. That's the one that the middle tier of the analytical components are then connecting to, still at the middle tier, right? They're connecting to that reports database, grabbing it out, then using the basically the WCF and the presentation foundation to throw it up into your front end, into your presentation layer, which is obviously where you're reading your reports. So the end user just sees the reports and all the nice little bits at the top. Underneath, it's done all that to get there. But it's a good example of why we need to consider this sort of thing for performance and scalability if we're going to go heavily into web analytics, right? The more stuff we're grabbing at the top, it may look nice when it's thrown out, but how much work is being done in that second and third tier? I won't talk too much about scalability now. But one thing to bear in mind when we start talking about this is the amount of databases that we are getting to, right? If you haven't noticed it already, you know, you're at 18 databases before you start. Quite easily. Now, in a SQL world, that's nothing. But in SharePoint land, it means we've got to know what we're managing, how we're configuring those for maintenance plans, etc. I'm not going to delve too much into this, because Spence is doing this, I think, today. Multi-tenancy. One of the features that hosters have always wanted is and not just hosters, I've actually think of real-world applications for this in the corporate world of partners and clients, etc. But it's all very well having all these services that are available, such as MMS and all the rest of it. But what if actually I had a core requirement to have one web application and then have 10 site collections underneath it, but each of those partners in each site collection needed a specific grouping of services to consume. So rather than the web app determine the consumption, we can actually use multi-tenancy to create service applications, in essence in a hosting mode, so that we can push them at site collections rather than web apps. So it is possible to go one more layer down. Now, I'm not going to spoil the fun for the session to go to see Spence today, but if you're thinking of deploying this, you need to go and see his session, because this is not a tick-box wizard approach. So it's not straightforward to set it up, but it will be if you follow the correct approach and the correct methodologies behind it. Lots of PowerShell. See, I knew I couldn't get through this session without mentioning PowerShell. Just, PowerShell, PowerShell, PowerShell. There you go. I've got it out of the way now. So let's bring all this together and see what it looks like. So obviously, we've all gone and installed SharePoint, and none of you have pressed the wizard to do it all for you, right? I just like to point that out. You know the one I'm on about? You know when you first install SharePoint and you go to that configuration wizard, and it basically pops up and says, tick this box, just whiz next, we'll just tick all these services, and I'm just going to set it all up for you, and it all works, right? We don't do that as IT pros. No. You should know what you're doing with these things. So we don't want to go there. We don't want to do that. We want to set it up properly. So we go to our managed service applications. Now, I've obviously created some service applications already in true Blue Peter fashion. So we have some that are there. And we can see here that when I create a particular service application, such as the managed metadata service, you can see that when we create a service, it creates an associated connection, a proxy. If whatever's required as part of that service, it's there. Now, when I create a service application, here's a real killer one to remember. Just because I've created a service application doesn't mean that I still don't have a server service to launch as well. Do you remember in SharePoint 2007 we had all those server services? Well, we didn't have that many compared to today. So we have a few. So just because I want to create a managed metadata service, as in an application service, I actually have to have a server service started first. So I can create 10 different MMS services. Oh no, another acronym. We're going to be texting services to people. So even though I might have the managed metadata service created 4 times in the application model, I still need to start the server service once on each server that's going to host that service. Okay, so if you've got 2 servers, it needs to be started on both. So if I was to create an application service, we click on the new in the ribbon for admins. Yay. Oh, come on, we love it, really. Okay, we don't, but anyway, we'll use it. And so we got our services that are available there. So if I was going to create, say, an Excel services, it'll take me into the configuration screen, and it will simply say, give me a name, define an application pool ID. Now, here's going to be an interesting thing, right? When you create application pool IDs to manage your application services, they are not available to your web applications for collaboration. They don't even show them. So when you create an application service, it will never be available if somebody goes and creates a web app to host site collections for users. The only services you see then are application services created for that model. So you'll only ever see application services if you select use an existing application pool, then you'll only see the ones that have been defined for application use. So you can obviously create a standard managed metadata service and use it across 3 managed metadata services. You don't have to create 1 per application service. Because if you did and you created 50 application services, you've got 50 application service app pools. Now, if that's your service level agreement, sure. But you don't have to. You can share those application services depending on the use. You'll notice as well, there's this new feature in 2010 of managed accounts. I remember having a company in 2007 that I was speaking to. They needed to change their service passwords every 30 days. Ouch. So they now had to script. They had to script the password creation, the password change, use STS-ADM to reapply it over all the web apps in SharePoint. We can now say, here's an account in Active Directory, add it as a managed account, and then if I want to define a password change automatically on that service account, it will do it through SharePoint and apply it automatically to the web app. Fit and forget. Fantastic. So for those people that have that requirement of service account management, where you might have a lot of them and have that service account password requirement, the managed account's a great feature for that. Nice little step up for us. Now, you'll notice that also at the bottom here it says, add this service applications proxy to the form's default proxy list. Remember I was talking about that proxy grouping, right? So that means all the services by default will have that ticked and therefore get added to this default proxy. Which means if you create a web application and say, just use the default proxy group, it's going to get all the services. If you don't want to put it in, you obviously untick it. But notice this service had no database. Okay? Also notice that I didn't really have a lot of other stuff to configure as part of it. Whereas if I went to a new managed metadata service, and you're going to go through all this in the session for the managed metadata, right? But the important thing to notice about this one is that we do have a database, but we also have something called a content type hub. So there's other pieces required before we can create this particular service. So some are simpler than others. That's the key thing to remember about the application services. But from an IT pro architect's model, we've now got the ability to create as many services as we need. We can then a la carte consume them in our web application environment without having to rebuild another service. If that service fits the bill that we've already created and I've got a web application that wants it, I can just consume it in. If I need another service for something else, I can create it because it doesn't exist and then consume it. So I could do that if I went into my application management. I have a link here called Configure Service Applications. If I go into my Manage Web Applications, which again gives me a lovely ribbon, and I could select my corp. Have you noticed you had to go down and click on that? Let's highlight it. Look, you see? That's natural for us admins to do that, isn't it? And then I can go to service connections. I go to service connections. It's taking me to the same page as before. This is where it's showing me which services this web app is consuming. If I don't like that one, and I'm not going to do it on Corp because I need it for my demo in about 20 minutes, I'll pick on partner sites. There you go. So there's one that's consuming a custom group of services. The important thing to note about that is the word custom is generic. The only time you can ever have a grouping of services that doesn't say custom is when you basically PowerShell the creation of the service, and in PowerShell you can actually specify a proxy name in PowerShell. Well, I've said that it might be an RTM for all we know. Anyway, so what we can see here is that I've got a custom proxy. So what if I turn around and didn't want to use the custom proxy? Well, what if I actually wanted to change that custom? If I go back to my configure service applications, I wanted to take you to this screen instead. I've got a few minutes still left. But you can see here that we've got my web apps that have been defined in central administration. We can see that I've got 4 web apps are currently consuming the default group of services, that default proxy set. I've then got 2 more web applications that have now been defined with their own custom set of services. And you'll notice that those services on the right-hand side are common across some of them. So if I go down to my record center and I don't like having the default set of services, I can obviously turn around and say, right, I'm going to custom group you. So this is not using the same custom that we had before. It's just basically saying, here's a custom set of services. So this proxy is now being taken out, and I just want this to consume from Corp, manage metadata, and the profile service. I click OK. We're done. Any site collections under that web app, we've now changed what they're consuming. Just like we used to do it with SSP and the web app, right? But we're now doing it at the per service layer. Cool. This is massive, guys, right? And girls, obviously. This is huge. How many people looking at this can predict that if they had this in 2007, they would have completely re-architected the way they approach things? Right. Because you would, wouldn't you? Because you'd suddenly go, hang on a minute, I have no restriction on that. I can now create 3 different services to host profiles and just basically cherry pick which ones I want. Which means to some degree you might have to architect your services at a more granular layer. Instead of one service that's this big behemoth, answer all questions, you've got lots of little smaller ones, and then you just basically go, that, and that suits my purpose for this partner. That, and that one suits this partner. All of those, except that, suits my corporate environment. If I want to change it back, it really is just a case of clicking on your record center one and saying, actually, just put it back to the default. If you really want to have a bit more control of the way your application services are created and named and grouped together in that sense, PowerShell is your friend. Because obviously PowerShell gives you a lot more parameters to define. And of course, because the UI gets locked fairly early in product development, one of the ways that they get a lot of features into manageability, certainly for IT pros, is through the command line. Remember STS-ADM, right? 100 and however odd. How many were they in the end? 180 or something, wasn't it? Was it 138? I can never get that the right way around. It's somewhere around there. PowerShell, 600 plus commandlets to do stuff. That'll be a really fun white paper to read, won't it? So Penny's got a PowerShell session. I can't remember if it's today or tomorrow. Is it today? Now? After me? Oh, she's not throwing anything at me. Oh, it's now that you're here. Oh, dear. Oh, never mind. We're recording it, right? You'll be able to get it later. It'll be on the DVD. You'll be able to watch it. Definitely, you guys need to watch that PowerShell, right? Start prepping at it. If you don't know it yet, you need to. Trust me. Get past that fear of command line. Okay, I can't think of anything else that we need to add at this point. Hope you've got a lot out of that, the architecture stuff. Come and ask me questions and ping me text questions for the Twitter and stuff for the Q&A. I'm sure you've all got lots of things you want to think about for that. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you soon.